In January of 1990, a technician inside a London broadcast facility threaded a tape into a machine, expecting nothing more than another routine hour of imported American science fiction. To most viewers, the program was harmless entertainment. Starships gliding through space, laser fire flashing across the screen, and philosophical speeches delivered between alien encounters. It was campy, idealistic, and familiar. Yet within moments of the episode beginning, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. A line of dialogue drifted from the speakers, and suddenly the people monitoring the broadcast realized they were no longer dealing with ordinary television. On the screen, a pale-faced android calmly explained that Ireland would one day become unified in the year 2024, and that this political victory would come through terrorism. The sentence lasted only seconds, but the effect was immediate. Executives froze. Technicians exchanged nervous glances. In a nation already torn apart by violence, bombings, and political hatred, the words sounded less like fiction and more like prophecy. The episode was from Star Trek, The Next Generation, a franchise celebrated around the world for preaching peace, diplomacy, and a hopeful future where humanity had moved beyond war and prejudice. Yet this single line triggered panic inside broadcasting institutions across Britain and Ireland. Censors feared the dialogue could inflame political tensions during one of the darkest periods of modern British history. Instead of airing the episode quietly and moving on, broadcasters effectively buried it. The tape was removed from rotation. Schedules were rewritten. Discussions erupted behind closed doors over whether science fiction had crossed into dangerous political territory. For years afterward, the episode became something almost mythical among fans. A forbidden piece of television history hidden away, because governments fear what audiences might think if they heard it. The controversial episode was titled The High Ground, a third-season installment of Star Trek, The Next Generation. On the surface, its story appeared straightforward. The crew of the USS Enterprise D travels to the troubled planet Russia to deliver medical supplies and assist local authorities. Soon after arriving, Dr. Beverly Crusher is kidnapped by a separatist group known as the Ansata. The Ansata are rebels fighting against what they see as an oppressive ruling government. Using a strange teleportation technology called the inverter, they launch sudden guerrilla-style attacks before disappearing instantly. But the technology comes with a horrifying cost. Every use of the inverter destroys the user's body on a cellular level, permanently damaging their DNA and slowly killing them. Their rebellion literally consumes them from the inside out. For American audiences in 1990, the stories seemed like classic allegorical science fiction. Writer Melinda Snodgrass intended the narrative to mirror the difficult moral realities of anti-colonial conflicts like the Algerian War of Independence against France. The script explored uncomfortable questions about terrorism, oppression, and political resistance. Captain Jean-Luc Picard finds himself trapped in an impossible situation familiar to many diplomatic conflicts throughout history. How do you support peace while recognizing that injustice and repression often create violent resistance movements in the first place? The episode refused to present simple heroes and villains. Instead, it lived in morally gray territory, forcing viewers to consider the relationship between state violence and revolutionary violence. The most explosive moment arrives not during an action scene, but during a calm philosophical discussion aboard the Enterprise. Lieutenant Commander Data, the emotionless android officer whose mind functions like a living encyclopedia, asks Captain Picard about historical rebellions and whether terrorism has ever successfully achieved political goals. Data then lists examples from human history with detached analytical precision. He references the American Revolution. He references the French Revolution. Then he calmly states that Irish reunification in 2024 was accomplished through terrorism. To many viewers outside the United Kingdom, it sounded like another clever piece of futuristic world-building. But inside Britain and Ireland, the line detonated like a bomb. At the time the episode was scheduled to air, the United Kingdom was trapped in the bloody violence of the Troubles. The Irish Republican Army, commonly known as the IRA, was actively carrying out bombings and attacks. British soldiers patrolled Northern Ireland heavily. Civilians on both sides lived with constant fear. Political tensions infected everyday life. In 1988, the British government had even imposed strict broadcasting restrictions, preventing the direct voices of Sinn Féin representatives and Republican paramilitary figures from being heard on television or radio. News organizations were forced to hire actors to dub over their statements. That was the climate in which this episode appeared. A popular American television show openly suggesting that terrorism would eventually lead to a united Ireland was seen as politically radioactive. The BBC reacted decisively. Rather than simply editing the line or shifting the episode to a later time slot, the network removed the high ground entirely from its initial run. Broadcasters in both the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland treated it as too dangerous to show. When the episode finally did appear years later, the controversial dialogue was cut completely from the soundtrack. British audiences would not see the unedited version until 2007, nearly 20 years after the episode had originally been filmed. A science fiction episode had effectively entered political exile. What makes the story even stranger is how reality slowly moved toward the fictional date mentioned in the script. As the calendar approached the real year 2024, journalists, science fiction fans, and political commentators revisited the episode. Repeatedly, online discussions exploded over whether Star Trek, The Next Generation, had somehow predicted the future. Although violent reunification did not occur, the controversy surrounding the episode demonstrated something remarkable about the franchise itself. Beneath its optimistic vision of the future, Star Trek had always possessed an uncanny ability to strike directly at humanity's deepest fears and political anxieties. That tension between hopeful storytelling and political controversy stretched all the way back to the creation of Star Trek in the 1960s. Creator Gene Roddenberry famously pitched the series to executives as Wagon Train to the Stars, presenting it as a safe space Western designed for mainstream audiences. But beneath that harmless exterior was something far more radical. Roddenberry and his writers used science fiction as camouflage for political commentary. Alien planets became stand-ins for real-world racial conflict, fascism, war, authoritarianism, and social injustice. The futuristic setting allowed the writers to discuss controversial subjects that networks might otherwise reject outright. Governments and broadcasters quickly realized the danger hidden beneath the franchise's glossy exterior. One of the most famous examples emerged in 1968 with the episode Patterns of Force. In the story, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock discover an alien planet modeled directly after Nazi Germany. A Federation historian named John Gill had violated Starfleet law by introducing fascist ideology to the planet, believing a controlled dictatorship could create order and efficiency. Instead, the society descended into violent authoritarianism, genocide, and militarism. American audiences understood the episode as a heavy-handed warning about fascism and absolute power. But in West Germany, where memories of World War II and the Holocaust remained painfully fresh, the imagery itself became unacceptable. German broadcasters were horrified by the sight of swastikas, Nazi uniforms, and salutes appearing inside a primetime entertainment program. The public broadcaster ZDF refused to air the episode entirely. Patterns of Force disappeared from German television schedules for decades. Viewers in Germany would not officially see the episode until specialized pay-TV broadcasts many years later, and public television did not fully air it until 2011, 43 years after its original release. The episode had become another entry in Star Trek's growing archive of censored material. Britain developed its own history of suppressing Star Trek episodes during the 1960s and 1970s. Unlike American audiences, who often viewed the series as philosophical science fiction aimed at adults, British television programmers scheduled the show during early evening family viewing hours. That decision created constant conflict with censors concerned about violence and psychological intensity. Over time, several episodes were quietly blacklisted from British television altogether. One banned episode was The Empath. The story traps Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy inside a dark underground chamber where they're psychologically and physically tortured by mysterious alien beings called the Vians. The episode's minimalist presentation, shadowy sets, painful interrogations, and prolonged suffering disturbed BBC executives deeply. They believed the intense focus on pain and psychological torment made it inappropriate for younger audiences. Another episode, Whom Gods Destroy, faced similar treatment because of its depiction of insanity, torture, and violence inside a futuristic asylum for dangerous criminals. Scenes involving electrical torture and unstable mental patients convinced British broadcasters that the episode crossed the boundaries of acceptable family entertainment. Yet perhaps the most culturally explosive Star Trek controversy centered around an episode remembered today not primarily for violence, but for a kiss. The episode Plato's Stepchildren featured Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura being mentally controlled by alien telepaths. Under that control, Kirk kisses Uhura on screen. The moment lasted only seconds, but it became television history as one of the first scripted interracial kisses broadcast on American television between a white man and a black woman. Behind the scenes, panic erupted at NBC. Executives feared Southern television affiliates might refuse to air the episode, damaging advertising revenue and provoking political backlash. Network officials ordered the scene filmed twice, once with a kiss and once with the actors pretending to kiss while avoiding direct contact on camera. But William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols reportedly sabotaged every alternate take intentionally, joking around and ruining the footage until the network had no usable backup version. The real kiss remained in the final episode, securing Star Trek's reputation as a cultural disruptor willing to challenge social norms despite corporate resistance. By the late 1980s, television standards had shifted dramatically. Audiences had become more tolerant of violence and horror imagery, and networks increasingly pushed creative boundaries. When Gene Roddenberry launched Star Trek, The Next Generation, he established strict creative rules insisting humanity had evolved beyond greed, corruption, and internal conflict. Fans later nicknamed these restrictions the Roddenberry Box. Writers were discouraged from portraying Starfleet officers fighting among themselves or revealing deep flaws within Federation society. Humanity, according to Roddenberry's vision, had transcended its darker instincts. Some writers rebelled against those restrictions almost immediately. Their resistance produced one of the most shocking and grotesque episodes in the entire franchise, Conspiracy. The episode begins like a paranoid political thriller. Captain Picard receives secret warnings from trusted Starfleet officers claiming something is terribly wrong within Starfleet Command itself. Orders no longer make sense. Strategic decisions appear irrational. Senior officials are behaving strangely. As Picard investigates further, he discovers that Starfleet has been infiltrated by parasitic alien creatures capable of taking complete control of human hosts. The revelation shattered one of the core assumptions of the Star Trek universe. The Federation, normally portrayed as humanity's enlightened future, suddenly appeared vulnerable to corruption from within. The horror intensified when Picard learned that the parasites physically crawled into their victims' bodies, wrapping themselves around a brain stem and hijacking the nervous system completely. Admirals and officers became puppets controlled by hidden invaders. The enemy was no longer outside Federation borders. The enemy sat inside government offices, wearing Starfleet uniforms and issuing official commands. The episode's climax stunned audiences and horrified television censors. Picard and Commander Riker confront the alien queen hidden inside Admiral Remick. Realizing they have no other option, they fire their phasers at maximum power. What follows remains one of the most graphic scenes ever broadcast in Star Trek history. Remick's face melts grotesquely under the phaser blasts. His skin bubbles and tears apart. Finally, his chest explodes open in a shower of gore, revealing the pulsating alien creature inside his ruined body. The violence shocked viewers because it violated expectations completely. Star Trek was supposed to represent enlightened optimism and intellectual storytelling, not graphic body horror. Some stations edited the sequence heavily before airing it. Others received complaints from parents disturbed by the imagery. Even longtime fans were stunned by how far the franchise had pushed itself visually. Yet the controversy surrounding Conspiracy reflected a deeper truth about Star Trek itself. Beneath its polished speeches about peace and exploration, the franchise constantly wrestled with humanity's fears about power, violence, fascism, racism, corruption, and political collapse. That tension explains why governments and broadcasters repeatedly found themselves afraid of Star Trek. The series never simply depicted aliens and spaceships. It held a distorted mirror up to society. Whether addressing fascism in Germany, interracial relationships in America, terrorism in Ireland, or institutional corruption within governments themselves, Star Trek transformed contemporary anxieties into futuristic allegories. Censors understood that audiences could recognize themselves inside those stories. That recognition made the franchise dangerous. Over time, many of the episodes once considered too controversial eventually became celebrated classics. Plato's Stepchildren is now remembered as an important milestone in television history. Patterns of Force is studied as an example of post-war cultural trauma and censorship. The High Ground has become legendary precisely because reality eventually drifted toward the fictional future it imagined. What once terrified broadcasters now fascinates historians and fans alike. But perhaps the strangest part of all is that Star Trek rarely intended to provoke outrage purely for shock value. The franchise's central mission was always philosophical. It asked difficult questions about morality, politics, violence, and humanity's future. Sometimes those questions landed too close to real wounds. Governments feared unrest. Networks feared backlash. Executives feared controversy. Yet the episode survived, circulating through bootlegs, conventions, reruns, and eventually streaming platforms until audiences could finally see them uncut. In the end, the history of Star Trek censorship says as much about the real world as it does about fiction. Every banned episode exposed the society's anxieties at that exact historical moment. Germany feared reminders of Nazism. Britain feared political violence and psychological horror. America feared interracial intimacy and social change. Science fiction merely became the delivery system for those fears. The futuristic settings made the stories appear distant, but the emotions underneath them were painfully immediate. That is why Star Trek remains culturally powerful decades later. The franchise promised a better future, but it never pretended humanity would reach that future easily. Again and again, it forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths hiding beneath politics, history, and social order. Sometimes governments try to suppress those truths. Sometimes